The sound of clinking silverware against ceramic plates filled the dimly lit corner booth of Romano's Italian bistro. But Maya Chen couldn't focus on anything except the tremor in her hands as she reached for her water glass. Across from her, her father's weathered face was already flushed with the particular shade of red that preceded his most devastating critiques, the kind that left scars deeper than any physical wound ever could. 26 years old and still can't manage to hold down a real job, Thomas Chen muttered, cutting into his veal parmigiana with aggressive precision. The knife scraped against the plate with a sound that made Maya's teeth ache. Your cousin Jennifer just bought her second investment property. Meanwhile, you're still playing pretend at that little nonprofit nobody's ever heard of. Maya's mother, Linda, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her manicured fingers fidgeting with the stem of her wineglass. She wore that familiar expression of someone caught between opposing forces, wanting to intervene but lacking the courage to challenge her husband's authority. It was the same look Maya had seen countless times throughout her childhood, during parent-teacher conferences where her father dismissed her academic achievements as not good enough, during high school graduation when he spent the entire ceremony criticizing her choice of university, during every family gathering where her accomplishments were minimized and her failures magnified under his relentless scrutiny. The Riverside Community Center serves over 3,000 families a year, Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. She had rehearsed these statistics in her mind, preparing for this exact moment, knowing that her father would inevitably steer their monthly dinner toward the familiar territory of her perceived inadequacies. We provide educational programs, job training, childcare services. Services that don't pay the bills, Thomas interrupted, his voice rising just enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Services that won't get you a house, a car worth driving, or any kind of financial security. You're wasting your degree, Maya, wasting your potential on people who will never appreciate what you're doing for them. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that her father, who had built his small accounting firm by serving the very same community demographic he now dismissed, could speak with such disdain about the work she found meaningful. But pointing out his hypocrisy had never been a winning strategy in these conversations. Instead, she found herself retreating inward, the familiar sensation of shrinking under his disapproval settling over her like a heavy blanket. What her parents didn't know, what Maya herself had been afraid to fully acknowledge, was that her position at the Riverside Community Center had evolved far beyond the entry-level coordinator role she had accepted 2 years ago. Director Sarah Martinez had been gradually entrusting her with more significant responsibilities: grant writing, program development, community outreach initiatives that had resulted in a 40% enrollment across all their services. Just last month, Sarah had hinted at a promotion to assistant director, a role that would come with not only increased compensation, but also the opportunity to implement the literacy program Maya had been developing in her spare time. But Maya had learned long ago that sharing good news with her father only provided him with more ammunition for his criticisms. Success was never quite successful enough in Thomas Chen's estimation. There was always a higher bar to reach, a more impressive achievement to be found lacking, a way to transform even the most positive developments into evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. "Do you know what your problem is?" Thomas continued, his voice carrying that particular tone that signaled he was building toward one of his signature, devastating conclusions. "You don't have any real ambition, no drive. You're content to settle for mediocrity because it's easier than actually pushing yourself to achieve something meaningful." Maya felt the familiar burn of tears threatening behind her eyes, but she had learned to suppress that response years ago. Crying in front of her father only reinforced his perception of her as weak, overly emotional, incapable of handling constructive criticism. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the weight of her grandmother's jade bracelet against her wrist, a small reminder of someone who had believed in her unconditionally, who had seen potential where her father saw only disappointment. The bracelet had been a gift on Maya's 18th birthday. passed down from her paternal grandmother, who had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that education could transform lives. Nai had worked multiple jobs to put herself through night school, eventually becoming one of the first female accountants in their small city. She had understood the value of service to community, the importance of lifting others as you climbed. But she passed away during Maya's sophomore year of college, taking with her the only voice in the family that had consistently encouraged Maya's dreams of social work. The Chen family has always been about excellence, Thomas was saying now, his voice taking on the lecturing tone that suggested this conversation was far from over. Your grandfather built a business from nothing. Your grandmother put 3 children through college while managing a household and caring for her own parents. I've spent 30 years building a practice that actually matters, that creates real value in the world. And what do you have to show for your efforts? A job that barely pays your rent and contributes nothing to society. Linda finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Thomas, perhaps we could... Could what? He snapped, turning his irritation toward his wife. Continue to enable her lack of ambition? Pretend that what she's doing actually matters? Maya needs to hear the truth, Linda. She's not a child anymore. She is an adult who's made a series of poor decisions, and those decisions have consequences. Maya's fingers tightened around her water glass as she watched her father's performance unfold with the weary familiarity of someone who had endured countless variations of the same scene. There was something almost theatrical about his cruelty, as if he derived genuine pleasure from the systematic destruction of her self-worth. She wondered sometimes if he practiced these speeches, if he lay awake at night crafting new ways to articulate her failures, new angles from which to approach the fundamental disappointment he felt in her existence. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the setting. Romano's had always been their special place when she was younger, the restaurant where they celebrated her academic achievements before those achievements stopped being quite good enough. Or maybe it was the awareness that she was finally truly happy with her work for the first time in her adult life, regardless of her father's approval. There was something about the way the evening light filtered through the restaurant's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across their table, that made this moment feel particularly significant, though she couldn't yet articulate why. "You want to know what I think?" Thomas said, leaning forward with the predatory focus of someone preparing to deliver a killing blow. "I think you're afraid. Afraid of real responsibility, afraid of taking risks, afraid of finding out that maybe you don't have what it takes to succeed in the real world. So you hide in that little nonprofit, surrounded by other people who've given up on actually making something of themselves, and you pretend that your settling for less is actually some kind of virtue." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Maya felt something inside her chest tighten, not with the familiar pain of his disapproval, but with a different sensation entirely. A kind of crystalline clarity that came from finally seeing the pattern clearly, understanding that this conversation had nothing to do with her career choices, and everything to do with her father's need to maintain control, to ensure that her successes never overshadowed his own sense of importance. She was about to respond, not with defensiveness this time, but with the quiet strength she had learned from working with families in crisis, families who faced real challenges that put her father's manufactured disappointments into perspective, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. 2 tables behind her father, partially obscured by a decorative pillar, but clearly visible if you knew where to look, sat Sarah Martinez, her boss. The woman who had become not just a supervisor, but a mentor, someone who had seen Maya's potential and invested in her growth. Sarah was dining with what appeared to be her wife and teenage daughter, clearly enjoying a family celebration of some kind, given the small wrapped gift beside her plate. And from the expression on Sarah's face, a mixture of shock, concern, and something that looked distinctly like protective anger, it was obvious that she had heard every word of Thomas Chen's performance. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Sarah's eyes meet hers across the restaurant. There was no pretending that this encounter hadn't happened, no way to minimize or explain away what Sarah had just witnessed. The professional reputation Maya had worked so carefully to build, the image of competence and emotional stability she had cultivated over 2 years, had just been shattered by her father's public humiliation. But as she held Sarah's gaze, Maya realized that what she saw there wasn't judgment or disappointment. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like recognition, the kind of understanding that passed between two women who had both navigated the complex dynamics of family expectations and professional ambition, who both understood the particular weight of trying to prove oneself worthy in a world that seemed determined to find you lacking. Thomas was still talking, his voice now loud enough to draw attention from several nearby tables, but Maya found herself no longer listening to his words. Instead, she was watching Sarah, who had quietly excused herself from her own table and was walking purposefully toward theirs, her expression calm but determined. The next few minutes, Maya realized, were going to change everything. Maya had learned to navigate her father's criticisms the way other people learn to navigate traffic, with hypervigilance, defensive reflexes, and an exhausting awareness that danger could emerge from any direction without warning. But as Sarah Martinez approached their table, Maya felt a different kind of anxiety flooding her system. This wasn't the familiar dread of disappointing her father. This was the terrifying possibility of losing the respect of someone whose opinion actually mattered to her. Sarah moved through the restaurant with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything: board meetings with city officials, crisis interventions with families in distress, the delicate negotiations required to maintain funding for their programs. She wore a simple navy dress that Maya recognized from our meeting with the mayor's office last week, when they had successfully secured additional funding for their after-school tutoring program. Maya remembered how proud she had felt that day, walking out of City Hall with Sarah's hand on her shoulder and the words, "I couldn't have done this without you," ringing in her ears. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying the particular tone of professional courtesy that Maya had learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but I believe I work with your daughter." Thomas looked up with the slightly annoyed expression of someone unused to being approached by strangers, but Maya watched his demeanor shift subtly as he registered Sarah's appearance, the way she carried herself, the quality of her clothing, the unmistakable aura of someone who commanded respect in professional settings. Her father had always been particularly attuned to social hierarchies, quick to defer to authority when it served his interests. "This is Sarah Martinez," Maya said quietly, her voice catching slightly on the words. "She's the director of the Riverside Community Center." "Ah," Thomas said, his tone brightening with the false warmth he reserved for potential business contacts. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I hope Maya has been a satisfactory employee." The word satisfactory hit Maya like a physical blow. Even in this moment, even when trying to make a good impression, her father couldn't bring himself to speak of her work with anything approaching pride or respect. She was, in his estimation, barely adequate, someone who might be tolerated rather than valued, endured rather than appreciated. Sarah's smile was polite but didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, Maya is one of the most dedicated and innovative staff members I've had the privilege of working with in 15 years of nonprofit management. She's transformed our approach to community engagement and has been instrumental in developing programs that have received recognition from the state education department." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment at being praised in front of her parents, but mostly from a deep gratitude that someone, finally, someone who mattered, was articulating her value in terms that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. These weren't the empty platitudes of a supervisor trying to be kind. These were specific, measurable acknowledgments of her contributions. Thomas's expression flickered between confusion and irritation. Maya could practically see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the struggle to reconcile Sarah's assessment with his own firmly held beliefs about his daughter's capabilities. "That's very generous of you to say," he managed finally, "though I'm sure she still has significant room for improvement." "I'm sure we all do," Sarah replied smoothly, but Maya's work speaks for itself. In fact, I was planning to speak with her this week about a promotion we're considering. The assistant director position has become available, and frankly, I can't imagine anyone more qualified for the role. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Maya watched her mother's eyes widen with surprise and something that might have been pride, while her father seemed to be processing this information with the expression of someone who had just been told that gravity worked differently than he had previously understood. Maya herself felt as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. She had hoped for this promotion, had even allowed herself to dream about what it might mean for her career and her sense of professional accomplishment. But hearing Sarah speak about it so definitively, with such confidence in her abilities, was both thrilling and terrifying. This was real. This was actually happening. Assistant director, Linda repeated softly, as if testing the words on her tongue. That sounds like quite an opportunity. It is, Sarah confirmed, her attention now focused entirely on Maya. The role would involve overseeing our educational programs, managing a staff of 12, and serving as the primary liaison with city officials and funding organizations. It's a significant responsibility, but I have complete confidence in Maya's ability to excel in the position. Thomas cleared his throat, his discomfort with the direction of the conversation becoming increasingly obvious. Well, that's certainly unexpected news. Though I have to ask, what does a position like that actually pay? Because in my experience, nonprofit salaries tend to be quite modest, regardless of the title. Maya felt her chest tighten with embarrassment. Of course her father would immediately focus on the financial aspects, would find a way to diminish this opportunity by reducing it to a simple matter of compensation. But Sarah's response surprised her. The position comes with a 35% salary increase from Maya's current compensation, plus full benefits and opportunities for additional professional development. It's quite competitive for the nonprofit sector, and the growth potential is excellent. Maya's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. A 35% increase would mean she could finally afford to move out of her cramped studio apartment, maybe even start saving for some of the goals she had pushed aside in favor of immediate survival. More importantly, it would mean recognition, official, documented acknowledgement of her value and potential. I see, Thomas said, though his tone suggested he was still struggling to integrate this new information into his worldview. And this promotion, it's based on merit, I assume, not simply because Maya is convenient or familiar. The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Maya felt the familiar burn of shame that came with her father's inability to believe that she might actually deserve good things that happened to her. Even faced with direct testimony from her supervisor, he couldn't accept that her success might be earned rather than given out of pity or convenience. Sarah's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Chen, Maya earned this opportunity through consistently exceptional performance, innovative thinking, and a level of dedication that has impressed not only me, but everyone she works with. She has increased program enrollment by 40%, written successful grants totaling over $200,000, and has developed community partnerships that have become models for other organizations in our network. And people quickly and accurately, Sarah's presentation of facts seemed to challenge his fundamental understanding of his daughter's capabilities. $200,000? Linda repeated, her voice filled with awe. Maya, you never mentioned... Because she's modest, Sarah interjected before Maya could respond, which is one of her many professional strengths. She doesn't seek credit or recognition. She simply does excellent work and lets the results speak for themselves. Maya felt tears threatening behind her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of frustration or humiliation. They were tears of relief, the overwhelming emotion that came with finally being seen, finally being understood and valued for who she actually was, rather than who her father believed she should be. Sarah's words weren't just professional courtesy, they were a recognition of Maya's fundamental worth as a person and as a professional. Well, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying a note of grudging acknowledgement. That's certainly more impressive than I realized, though I still maintain that the nonprofit sector has limited potential for long-term financial growth. Maya found herself speaking before she could stop herself, her voice stronger and clearer than she had managed all evening. It's not just about financial growth, Dad. It's about making a difference. It's about using my skills in education to actually help people, to solve real problems in our community. The families we work with, they matter. The children in our programs, they deserve someone who believes in them, who sees their potential even when no one else does. The words seemed to surprise her even as she spoke them, but they felt true in a way that cut through all the careful politeness and defensive strategies she usually employed in these conversations. This was who she was. This was what mattered to her. And for the first time in her adult life, she had professional validation that her choices weren't just naive idealism, but actual, measurable contributions to her community. Sarah smiled, and Maya recognized the expression as the same one she wore when a particularly challenging family finally broke through to stability, when a struggling child mastered a concept they had been working on for months, when the seemingly impossible became suddenly, tangibly real. "I should let you return to your dinner," Sarah said, but her attention remained focused on Maya. "But I do hope we can schedule that meeting this week. I'd like to discuss the details of the position and get your thoughts on some ideas I have for expanding our services." As Sarah walked back to her table, Maya felt something fundamental shift in the dynamic at their own table. Her parents sat in uncharacteristic silence, both seeming to process what they had just witnessed. Thomas, in particular, appeared to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance between his long-held beliefs about his daughter and the evidence that had just been presented to him by someone whose authority he couldn't easily dismiss. Maya realized that this moment, this unexpected collision between her professional and personal worlds, might be the beginning of something entirely new. Not just the promotion, though that was significant, but the possibility that she might finally stop seeking her father's approval and start living fully into the person she had always been beneath his relentless criticism. The evening was far from over, but already everything had changed. The silence that followed Sarah's departure stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken tensions and shifting power dynamics. Maya watched her father push his veal around his plate, his earlier appetite apparently diminished by the unexpected challenge to his worldview. "So," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something Maya couldn't quite identify, "how long has this promotion been in discussion?" Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded her father's interrogations. Even when presented with evidence of her success, he seemed compelled to find fault, to discover some flaw in the narrative that would restore his sense of superiority. "Sarah mentioned it a week ago," she said carefully, "but tonight was the first time she discussed it in detail."
"And you didn't think to mention this to your parents?" Thomas's tone sharpened with accusation. "A potential career advancement of this magnitude, and you kept it to yourself?" The irony of his question wasn't lost on Maya. She had learned through painful experience that sharing good news with her father inevitably led to its systematic destruction. Every achievement was minimized, every success was qualified with "but" statements that reduced her accomplishments to accidents or insufficiencies. She had stopped sharing her professional victories not out of secrecy, but out of self-preservation. "I wanted to wait until it was official," Maya said, though the explanation felt inadequate even to her. The truth was more complex, more painful to articulate, that she had protected this possibility from his criticism because she needed something in her life that remained untainted by his disapproval. Thomas set down his fork with deliberate precision. "And this Sarah Martinez, how well do you really know her? Because from where I sit, that interaction seemed rather orchestrated. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Her happening to be here tonight, overhearing our conversation, swooping in to play the hero?" Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. Of course her father would find a way to twist even this validation into something suspicious, something that diminished rather than celebrated her worth. The idea that Sarah's praise might be somehow manufactured, motivated by pity, rather than genuine recognition of her abilities, struck at the heart of every insecurity Maya had ever harbored about herself. "Thomas," Linda said quietly, her voice carrying a note of warning, "I think you might be what? Asking reasonable questions? A supervisor doesn't typically approach an employee's family during personal time to discuss promotions that haven't been officially offered. The whole thing feels performative." Maya felt heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment this time, but from anger. Pure, clean anger that cut through years of learned deference and self-doubt. "Performative," she repeated, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "You think Sarah's praise was performative?" "You think," Thomas said, leaning forward with the air of someone delivering uncomfortable truths, "that your supervisor recognized a family conflict and decided to intervene in a way that would make her look good while putting me in an awkward position. It's a classic power play, Maya. The fact that you can't see it suggests exactly the kind of professional naivete I've been trying to help you overcome." The word help landed like a slap. Maya stared at her father across the table, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in her adult life. This wasn't love expressing itself through tough guidance. This wasn't concern manifesting as high standards. This was something else entirely. Something that fed on her diminishment, that required her failure to sustain his own sense of superiority. "You want to know what's naive?" Maya asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Thinking that the only reason someone might value my work is pity, believing that my successes must be accidents or conspiracies, because the alternative, that I might actually be competent, might actually deserve recognition, is apparently impossible for you to accept." Thomas's expression darkened. "Watch your tone, young lady. I'm still your father, and I won't be spoken to with disrespect." Disrespect? The word came out louder than Maya intended, causing several nearby diners to turn their attention toward their table. She felt Linda's hand reach across the table toward her arm, a familiar gesture meant to de-escalate, to restore peace at the cost of truth. But Maya had moved beyond the reach of her mother's careful diplomacy. "Is it disrespectful to point out that you've spent 26 years telling me I'm not good enough, that nothing I accomplish is ever quite enough to earn your approval, that even when my boss, someone whose judgment you claim to respect, tells you specifically what I've achieved, your immediate response is to assume it must be fake?" "I'm trying to protect you from disappointment," Thomas said, his own voice rising to match hers. "The real world doesn't give out participation trophies, Maya. If you can't handle honest assessment of your performance—" "Honest assessment?" Maya laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is it honest to call me worthless? Is it honest to dismiss work that serves 3,000 families as meaningless? Is it honest to suggest that my supervisor is lying when she describes the impact of programs I've developed?" The restaurant around them seemed to fade into background noise, as years of suppressed frustration finally found their voice. Maya felt as if she were watching herself from a distance, surprised by her own capacity for confrontation, but unable to stop the words that had been building pressure inside her chest for decades. "You want to know what I think?" she continued, echoing the structure of his earlier attacks. "I think you're afraid. Afraid that if you actually acknowledged my achievements, you might have to confront the possibility that your way isn't the only way. That success might look different than what you've decided it should look like. That your daughter might actually be capable of making good decisions for her own life." Thomas's face had gone from red to a pale shade of gray that worried Maya even through her anger, but he wasn't finished. "You want to talk about fear? Let's talk about your fear of real responsibility. Your fear of taking risks that actually matter. You hide in that nonprofit because it's safe, because failure there doesn't really count. It's playing house with other people's problems, Maya. It's not real work." "Not real work?" Maya's voice cracked with incredulity. I spend my days working with families who are one paycheck away from homelessness. I develop educational programs for children whose schools have given up on them. I write grants to fund services that keep elderly community members in their homes instead of institutions. I coordinate with social services to ensure that victims of domestic violence have safe places to go with their children. How is any of that not real work? Because it doesn't build anything lasting, Thomas shot back. It's just maintenance. Keeping broken systems running instead of actually fixing them or building something better. It's noble, I'll give you that, but it's not ambitious. It's not the kind of work that changes the world. Maya felt something crystallize inside her chest, a clarity that cut through the emotional chaos of their confrontation. She racked her brain for a response that would shut him down, something comment. She was about to point out the vital role her organization played in preventing complete social collapse when something smaller but true came to her. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice suddenly calm in contrast to the heated exchange they had been engaged in. "It doesn't change the world. It changes individual worlds, one family at a time, one child at a time, one person who finally has access to resources they need to build a better life." She paused, watching her father's face carefully. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you? Because individual impact doesn't matter to you. It has to be big, measurable, impressive to other people. It has to reflect well on you." "Maya," Linda said softly, her voice carrying a note of desperate pleading, "please, let's just try to enjoy the rest of our dinner." But Maya was beyond the reach of her mother's peacekeeping efforts. Something had broken open inside her, and she found herself unable to return to the careful politeness that had characterized their family dynamic for so many years. "No, Mom," she said, her attention still focused on her father. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of sitting here month after month, listening to him tear apart everything I care about, everything I've worked for, everything that gives my life meaning. I'm tired of protecting his feelings by minimizing my own accomplishments." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "There it is," he said quietly. "The real Maya. Selfish, self-centered, unable to accept constructive criticism without having an emotional breakdown. This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. You don't have the temperament for real leadership. Real success requires the ability to handle pressure without falling apart." Maya felt the words hit their intended target, felt the familiar doubt begin to creep in around the edges of her anger. Her father was an expert at this particular form of psychological warfare, allowing her to build up steam, to express her frustrations, and then using her emotional response as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy.
But something had changed. Maybe it was Sarah's validation. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 2 years of professional success. Or maybe it was simply that Maya had finally reached a breaking point where the pain of speaking up had become less than the pain of remaining silent. Whatever the catalyst, she found herself responding from a place of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You know what?" she said, reaching for her purse. "You're absolutely right. I am emotional. I do care deeply about things. I do take criticism personally when it comes from someone whose opinion should matter to me. But you know what else? Those aren't weaknesses. Those are exactly the qualities that make me good at my job. Empathy, passion, the ability to connect with people who are struggling, the willingness to take risks for causes I believe in." She stood up from the table, her legs surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn your respect by becoming someone you might approve of. But you know what I've realized? Your approval isn't worth having if it requires me to dismiss everything that actually matters to me." Thomas looked up at her with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been respect, though Maya couldn't be certain. "Maya," he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening, "sit down. Let's finish our conversation like adults." "No," Maya said simply. This conversation has been going on for 26 years, Dad, and I'm done with it. As Maya walked toward the restaurant's exit, Maya caught a glimpse of Sarah's table. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah offered a small nod of what looked like encouragement, perhaps even pride. Maya realized that she had just demonstrated exactly the kind of strength and conviction that Sarah valued in her professional life. The willingness to stand up for what mattered, even when it was difficult, even when it came at a cost. The evening air outside Romano's felt cool against her flushed skin, and Maya took her first deep breath in what felt like hours. She had no idea what came next, no idea how her relationship with her parents might recover from this confrontation, no idea whether she had just made the biggest mistake of her personal life. But for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely, authentically herself. Maya's apartment had never felt smaller than it did at 11:30 that night when the adrenaline from her confrontation with her father finally began to ebb and left her pacing the narrow space between her futon and her kitchen counter. Her hands still trembled slightly as she made chamomile tea, though whether from leftover anger, anxiety about the consequences of her outburst, or maybe something approaching relief, she couldn't tell. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since she'd left the restaurant. Texts from her mother that she wasn't ready to read, a missed call from her father that she definitely wasn't ready to return, and surprisingly, a message from Sarah that simply read, "Free for coffee tomorrow morning? I think we should talk." Maya had stared at that message for 20 minutes, analyzing every possible interpretation. Was Sarah having second thoughts about the promotion offer? Had witnessing Maya's family dynamics raised concerns about her emotional stability or professional judgment? The rational part of Maya's mind reminded her that Sarah had seemed supportive during the restaurant confrontation, but the part of her psyche that had been shaped by years of her father's criticism whispered that professional sympathy was very different from professional confidence. She was still debating how to respond when her apartment buzzer rang. Maya frowned at her intercom system. It was nearly midnight and she wasn't expecting anyone. But when she pressed the talk button, her mother's voice came through the speaker, tired and strained. "Maya, honey, it's Mom. Can we talk?" Maya's finger hovered over the door release button. Part of her wanted to ignore the request, to maintain the boundaries she had finally managed to establish at dinner. But Linda had looked genuinely distressed as Maya stormed out of the restaurant, and despite everything, Maya couldn't bring herself to punish her mother for her father's behavior. "Come up," she said, pressing the button. Linda appeared at Maya's door, looking older than her 52 years, her usually perfect makeup smudged and her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled. Purse with both hands, as if it were a lifeline, and her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion or tears or both. "I hope you don't mind the coming by so late," Linda said as Maya let her in. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about tonight, about everything that happened, and I realized there are things I should have said a long time ago." Maya poured her mother a cup of tea without asking, partly because hospitality felt like safer territory than emotional honesty, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands while she waited to see what direction this conversation might take. "Your father is furious," Linda said without preamble, settling onto Maya's small couch with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain composure through force of will. "But he's also confused, I think. The things your supervisor said tonight, about your work, about your achievements, he's having trouble reconciling them with what he believed about your career." Maya sat in her desk chair, maintaining physical distance while she tried to gauge her mother's intentions. "And what did he believe about my career?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring into her teacup as if it might contain answers to questions she was afraid to ask out loud. "He believed that you were wasting your potential," she said finally. "That you were hiding from real challenges because you were afraid of failing at something that mattered." The words stung, partly because Maya recognized them as an accurate summary of her father's perspective, and partly because she realized how deeply her mother had internalized and accepted that perspective without question. "And what do you believe, Mom?" Maya looked up with surprise, as if the possibility that her own opinion might be relevant hadn't occurred to her. It was an expression Maya recognized from childhood, the look of someone who had grown so accustomed to deferring to her husband's judgment that she had lost track of her own thoughts and feelings. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I've spent 26 years letting my father speak for both of us, instead of finding my own voice. And I believe that watching you stand up to him tonight was one of the most terrifying and inspiring things I've ever witnessed." Maya felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She had always seen her mother as complicit in her father's criticism, as someone who chose family harmony over defending her daughter. But now she was beginning to understand that Linda might be as trapped in the family dynamic as Maya herself had been, just from a different angle. "Terrifying and inspiring," Maya repeated softly. "That's an interesting combination." "Terrifying because I knew there would be consequences," Linda said, her voice gaining strength. "Your father doesn't handle being challenged well, especially not in public. And inspiring because I've been wanting to say some of those things for years, but I never had the courage." Maya set down her teacup, studying her mother's face in the dim light of her apartment. "What things?" Linda took a shaky breath before continuing. "That your work matters, that the way you care about people, really care, not just professionally, but personally, is a gift, not a weakness. That watching you develop those programs, seeing how the families in our neighborhood talk about you and the center, Maya, I've been proud of you for years. I just never said it because your father had already decided it wasn't worth being proud of." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had known existed. Maya felt years of resentment begin to shift, not disappearing entirely, but reorganizing themselves around a new understanding of her mother's position in the family structure. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Maya asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because your father is very forceful in his opinions, in his certainty about what's right and wrong, and because somewhere along the way I stopped trusting my own judgment about what mattered." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Do you know that I wanted to be a teacher when I married your father?" Maya shook her head. This was new information, a piece of her mother's history that had never surfaced in family conversations. Elementary education. I'd already been accepted to the graduate program when Thomas and I got engaged, but he convinced me that teaching wouldn't provide enough financial stability for our future family, that I should focus on supporting his business instead. Linda's smile was tinged with something that might have been regret. He wasn't entirely wrong. His practice did need support in those early years. But I sometimes wonder what might have been different if I had maintained my own professional identity. The revelation recontextualized years of family dynamics for Maya. Her mother's quiet deference, her reluctance to challenge Thomas's authority, even her apparent acceptance of his dismissive attitude towards service-oriented careers. It all made more sense when viewed through the lens of someone who had given up her own dreams of teaching to support someone else's ambition. "Mom," Maya said gently, "it's not too late. There are lots of ways to get involved in education, especially with your business experience." Linda laughed, but it was a sound filled with wonder rather than bitterness. "You know what's funny? Your supervisor, Sarah, she said something tonight that's been running through my head about how your work changes individual worlds, one person at a time. That's exactly what I used to dream about doing in a classroom." Maya felt a sudden vivid image of her mother working with children, bringing the same gentle patience to teaching that she had always shown in our personal relationships. It was a vision that felt both completely natural and entirely revolutionary. The idea that Linda Chen might have her own aspirations, her own definition of meaningful work. "The center always needs volunteers," Maya said carefully, not wanting to push too hard, but unable to resist planting the seed. "Especially for our adult literacy programs. People who understand business, who can help our participants develop financial literacy skills." Linda's eyes lit up with interest, and Maya caught a glimpse of what her mother might have looked like at 22, full of plans and possibilities before she learned to see herself primarily through her husband's expectations. "Tell me more about that," Linda said, leaning forward with an engagement Maya hadn't seen from her in years. For the next hour, Maya found herself describing her work in detail for the first time in her adult life, not defending it against criticism, not minimizing its importance to avoid conflict, but sharing it with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made it meaningful. She talked about Mrs. Rodriguez, who had learned to read at 63 and now helped other Spanish-speaking adults navigate English bureaucracy. She described the after-school program that had helped Marcus Williams improve his math scores enough to qualify for high school advanced placement courses. She explained the community garden project that had not only provided fresh vegetables for low-income families, but had also created a gathering space where neighbors who had lived on the same block for years finally got to know each other. "Maya," Linda said when she finished, "listening to you talk about this work, you sound like the person I always hoped you would become. Passionate, committed, making a real difference in people's lives. I can't believe I ever let your father convince me that wasn't enough." The words hit Maya with unexpected force. She realized that she had been seeking this recognition, this acknowledgement of her worth and her choices from her parents for years. But she had focused so intensely on earning her father's respect that she had never given her mother the opportunity to express her own feelings about Maya's path. "There's something else," Linda said, her tone becoming more serious. "Something I think you should know about your father's reaction tonight. After you left, after we paid the bill and drove home, he called your grandmother." Maya's breath caught. "Nai is dead, Mom."
No, honey, your father's mother, your other grandmother, Grandma Chen. Maya felt confused. Her paternal grandmother, Thomas's mother, lived in a nursing home about an hour away and had been battling dementia for several years. Maya visited her occasionally, but the conversations were often difficult because Grandma Chen frequently confused Maya with other people or events from decades past. He called her at almost 11 o'clock, which you know he never does. He usually considers anything past 9 too late for elderly people. But he was agitated, upset, and he needed to talk to someone about what happened tonight. What did he tell her? Linda paused, as if choosing her words carefully. He told her about your promotion, about what your supervisor said. And then he asked her something I've never heard him ask anyone before. He asked her if he had been wrong about you. Maya felt the world shift slightly around her. Her father, who approached every situation with absolute certainty about his own judgment, had actually questioned his assessment of her career and her choices. What did she say? "That's the remarkable part," Linda said, her voice soft with something that sounded like awe. "Her dementia comes and goes, you know that, but tonight, she was completely clear, completely herself, and she told him that she had been worried about him for years." Maya waited, sensing that there was more to the story. She told him that watching him criticize you reminded her of his own father, your grandfather, and how destructive that constant criticism had been to their family. She said that your grandfather never learned to see success that didn't look exactly like his own success, and that it had cost him relationships with all 3 of his children. Maya had never known her grandfather well. He had died when she was young, but she remembered him as a stern, distant figure who seemed perpetually disappointed with everyone around him. The idea that her father might be repeating patterns from his own childhood added another layer of complexity to their family dynamics.
She told him, Linda continued, that you reminded her of herself at your age, passionate about helping people, willing to work hard for causes you believed in, but also sensitive to criticism from people you loved. She said it had taken her years to recover from your grandfather's constant disapproval, and she didn't want to watch Thomas make the same mistakes with you. Maya felt tears threatening behind her eyes. Her grandmother had always been kind to her, but Maya hadn't realized that she saw similarities between their experiences, hadn't known that her own struggles with her father's criticism echoed patterns from previous generations. How did Dad respond to all that? Linda was quiet for a long moment. He cried, she said finally. I haven't seen your father cry since his mother's first stroke 5 years ago, but he cried. And he said he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. Maya felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding. Her father's criticism hadn't emerged from nowhere. It was part of a generational pattern of men who struggled to express love except through the mechanism of impossible standards. That didn't excuse his behavior, didn't minimize the damage it had caused, but it provided a context that made his actions comprehensible rather than simply cruel. I don't know what this means for your relationship with him, Linda said, reaching across the space between them to touch Maya's hand. I don't know if he's capable of changing patterns that are so deeply ingrained, but I think tonight was the first time he's ever seriously considered the possibility that his approach might be wrong. Maya squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the calluses that came from years of typing and filing and managing the business side of her father's accounting practice. What about you, Mom? What does this mean for you? Linda smiled, and Maya saw something in that expression she hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet determination that suggested her mother might be on the verge of her own transformation. It means I'm going to start having my own opinions again, Linda said, starting with volunteering for those literacy programs you mentioned, and maybe taking some education courses at the community college, and definitely speaking up when I disagree with your father instead of just going along to keep the peace. Maya felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. Not bitter laughter this time, but something that felt like relief and possibility and hope all mixed together. That's going to be an adjustment for him. Yes, Linda said, her smile widening. Yes, it is. As her mother prepared to leave, Maya realized that the evening's confrontation had accomplished something she had never expected. It had created space for truth-telling that went beyond her own relationship with her father. Her willingness to finally speak her mind had somehow given her mother permission to begin finding her own voice again. Maya, Linda said as she gathered her purse and coat, I know I should have said this years ago, but I want you to know you chose exactly the right career. The way you care about people, the way you fight for things that matter, that's not naivete or lack of ambition. That's integrity. That's the kind of success that actually changes the world. After her mother left, Maya sat in her quiet apartment and allowed herself to fully absorb what had happened. In the space of a few hours, her professional life had taken a dramatic leap forward. Her relationship with her father had reached a crisis point that might lead to genuine change, and her mother had revealed depths of understanding and support that Maya had never suspected existed. Her phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Whatever happened at dinner tonight, don't let it overshadow your accomplishments. Coffee at 9 a.m.? I have some ideas I want to run by you. Maya typed back quickly, yes, and thank you for everything. As she finally settled into bed, Maya's mind was spinning with possibilities. The promotion Sarah had mentioned would open doors she had only dreamed of. Her mother's offer to volunteer might bridge the gap between Maya's professional and personal worlds in ways that could benefit everyone involved. And her father's conversation with his own mother suggested that change, real, fundamental change, might actually be possible even in relationships that had seemed permanently damaged. For For the first time in her adult life, Maya fell asleep not worrying about disappointing the people she loved, but excited about the possibility of building something beautiful with the people who truly understood her worth. 3 weeks later, Maya stood before the Riverside Community Center's board of directors wearing the navy blazer her mother had insisted on buying for her first official presentation as assistant director. The conference room was packed beyond capacity. Board members, city officials, current staff, and community leaders all gathered to hear Maya's proposal for expanding their services into what she was calling the Intergenerational Literacy Initiative. Sarah sat in the front row, beaming with the pride of a mentor, watching her protege step fully into her own power. Next to her, somewhat surprisingly, sat Linda Chen, wearing a volunteer badge and taking careful notes on everything Maya said. Her mother had thrown herself into the literacy program with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time, and in just 3 weeks had already become indispensable to their adult education efforts. The data speaks for itself, Maya was saying, clicking to her next slide with the confidence that came from months of preparation and years of hands-on experience. When we pair adult learners with teenage tutors from our after-school program, both groups show dramatic improvement in standardized assessments. The adults gain literacy skills in a supportive, non-judgmental environment, while the teenagers develop leadership abilities and a deeper connection to their community. She paused, scanning the room and making eye contact with each board member as Sarah had taught her. But the impact goes beyond test scores. We're creating relationships that break down generational and cultural barriers. We're developing a model that other communities can replicate, and we're proving that education is most powerful when it flows in multiple directions. Dr. Patricia Williams, the board chair and former superintendent of schools, leaned forward with obvious interest. Maya, can you speak to the sustainability of this program? How do we ensure it continues to grow without overwhelming our current resources? Maya had anticipated this question and felt a thrill of confidence as she moved to her next slide. Actually, Dr. Williams, that's where the beauty of this model becomes apparent. The program is largely self-sustaining once we establish the initial structure. Our teenage tutors earn community service credits that many colleges now recognize for scholarship purposes. Our adult learners often transition into volunteer roles themselves, helping the next cohort of participants. And the partnerships we've developed with local businesses mean that many of our adult graduates find employment with companies that have invested in their education. She clicked again, revealing a slide that showed photographs of program participants. Mrs. Rodriguez helping a new Spanish-speaking immigrant navigate healthcare paperwork, Marcus Williams teaching basic computer skills to seniors, families reading together in the community garden that had grown from a small plot into a neighborhood gathering space. This isn't charity, Maya continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into the heart of her presentation. This is community building. We're not just providing services, we're creating connections that make our entire neighborhood stronger. City Councilwoman Janet Torres raised her hand. What kind of funding are we looking at for full implementation? Maya felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was the moment when proposals often died, when the reality of budget constraints crushed even the most well-intentioned programs. But she had spent weeks working with Sarah to develop a funding strategy that was both ambitious and realistic. The initial investment is significant, $250,000 for the first year, which would allow us to serve 400 families and establish the infrastructure for long-term growth. However, we've already secured preliminary commitments for 60% of that funding through a combination of federal grants, foundation support, and local business partnerships. She paused, noting the surprised expressions around the table. Maya had discovered that she had a talent for grant writing that went beyond simple technical skill. She could tell stories that made abstract policy goals feel personal and urgent, could translate community needs into the language that funders understood. Additionally, she continued, our projections show that the program will achieve 75% self-funding within 3 years through fee-for-service contracts with other municipalities, corporate partnerships, and what we're calling graduate giving, contributions from program alumni who want to support the services that help them. Dr. Williams exchanged glances with several other board members, and Maya recognized the look of people who had come prepared to be politely skeptical and instead found themselves genuinely impressed. "Maya," said James Patterson, the board treasurer, "these numbers are quite sophisticated. Have you had professional assistants developing this business model?" Maya smiled, thinking of the countless late-night sessions she had spent with spreadsheets and projection models, drawing on knowledge she had gained not just from her social work degree, but from years of watching her father's business operate. "Actually, Mr. Patterson, I developed these projections myself, with input from our current staff and feedback from similar programs in other cities. It turns out that growing up around a small business taught me more about financial planning than I realized at the time." The comment drew gentle laughter from several board members, but Maya noticed that it also seemed to shift something in the room's energy. She was no longer the young idealist asking for support for a feel-good program. She was a professional presenting a comprehensive plan for sustainable community development.
Sarah stood up from her seat in the front row. "If I may," she said, addressing the board, "I want to note something for the record. Maya has been developing components of this program for over a year, largely on her own time and initiative. The 40% increase in program enrollment we've seen over the past year, that's directly attributable to her community outreach efforts. The partnerships with local businesses, Maya identified those opportunities and cultivated those relationships. The grant funding we've secured, Maya wrote those proposals." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but this time it was the warmth of recognition rather than embarrassment. Sarah was doing something Maya had never experienced from a supervisor, taking her accomplishments and amplifying them rather than minimizing them. "What I'm saying," Sarah continued, "is that this isn't just a good program with an impressive proposal. This is a demonstration of exactly the kind of innovative leadership our community needs. Maya hasn't just identified a problem and suggested a solution. She's already begun implementing that solution and proven its effectiveness." Dr. Williams nodded slowly. "Maya, I have one more question. This program would represent a significant expansion of your responsibilities and our organizational scope. Are you prepared for that level of challenge?" Maya thought about her father's words from 3 weeks ago, his suggestions that she was afraid of real responsibility, that she chose safe options to avoid the possibility of meaningful failure. She thought about her grandmother's stories of building something from nothing, of taking risks for causes that mattered. She thought about the families whose lives had already been changed by programs she had helped develop, and the families who were still waiting for opportunities that didn't yet exist. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I've spent the last 2 years learning that the most meaningful work is often the most challenging work. I've also learned that when you're addressing real needs in your community, when you're building something that actually matters to people's lives, you find resources and energy you didn't know you had." She paused, looking around the room at faces that had moved from polite attention to genuine engagement. "But more importantly, I've learned that I don't have to do this work alone. The strength of this program is that it brings people together, not just participants, but also staff, volunteers, community partners, families who want to support the services that have helped them. I'm not just asking you to fund a program, I'm asking you to invest in a model of community development that creates its own support system." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. As board members filed out of the conference room, shaking Maya's hand and offering congratulations, Linda approached with tears in her eyes. "Maya," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "listening to you present today, I kept thinking about how proud Nai would be and how proud I am, not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become." Maya hugged her mother, feeling the solidity of a relationship that had transformed completely in just 3 weeks. Linda had not only thrown herself into volunteer work with impressive dedication, but had also begun speaking up in her marriage in ways that were creating space for all of them to be more honest with each other. Mom, none of this would have happened without everything I learned from watching you manage Dad's business all these years. You taught me how to work with budgets, how to organize complex projects, how to communicate with people who have different priorities. You just never realized you were teaching me those things. As the conference room emptied, Sarah approached with the expression of someone who had more to say. Maya, I know this has been an overwhelming few weeks for you. The promotion, the family situation, and now this program approval. But I want you to know that watching you navigate all of this, the way you've handled pressure, the way you've maintained your vision while adapting to feedback, the way you've turned personal challenges into professional strength, it's confirmed something I suspected when I first hired you. Maya waited, sensing that Sarah was building towards something significant.
I've been offered a position with the State Education Department, Sarah continued, Director of Community Engagement for the entire region. It's an opportunity I've been working toward for years, and it would mean leaving the center. Maya felt her heart sink. Sarah had been more than a supervisor. She had been a mentor, advocate, and example of the kind of leader Maya hoped to become. The idea of continuing this work without her guidance felt daunting. But, Sarah continued, her expression brightening, the position comes with the authority to establish satellite programs and regional partnerships. Maya, I want you to consider applying for my position here, Director of the Riverside Community Center, with the mandate to expand your intergenerational literacy model to other communities throughout the region. Maya felt the world tilt slightly around her. Director? The position would represent not just career advancement, but the opportunity to shape the future of community-based education programs across their entire metropolitan area. I know it's a lot to consider, Sarah said gently. You'd be supervising a staff of 20, managing an annual budget of over $1 million, and serving as the primary liaison with city and state officials. But Maya, you're ready for this. Your presentation today proved that you have the vision, the technical skills, and the community relationships to not just maintain what we've built here, but to expand it in ways that could influence policy at the state level. Maya thought about the girl who had sat in Romano's 3 weeks ago, absorbing her father's criticism and doubting her own worth. That person felt like someone from another lifetime, someone who had been holding herself back, not because she lacked ability, but because she had never received permission to fully believe in that ability. Sarah, she said slowly, I'm honored that you think I'm ready for this, and I'm excited about the possibility. But I have one request. Of course. I want to maintain the community garden, and I want to expand it into a teaching garden where families can learn about nutrition, sustainable growing practices, and food preservation. I know it's not directly related to literacy, but I think it's part of what makes our model work. The idea that education happens everywhere, not just in classrooms. Sarah's smile was radiant. Maya, that's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that makes you the right person for this job. And yes, absolutely. In fact, I think the teaching garden could become a model for integrating environmental education with community development. As Maya walked home that evening, she found herself taking a detour through the neighborhood she served every day. She passed Mrs. Rodriguez's house, where lights were on in the living room and she could see the outline of a woman reading to a child. She walked by the community center itself, where the after-school program was still in session and teenage voices drifted through open windows. She paused at the community garden where families were working together in the warm evening light, harvesting vegetables and teaching children the names of plants in multiple languages. This was her community. These were her people. And tomorrow she would begin the process of applying to officially lead the organization that served them all. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart skipped slightly when she saw that it was from her father. Your mother told me about your presentation today. I'm proud of you. Would you have dinner with us this Sunday? I'd like to hear about your new position. Maya read the message 3 times, looking for the criticism or qualification that usually accompanied any expression of approval from Thomas. But there wasn't one. Just acknowledgement, pride, and what sounded like genuine interest in her work. She typed back, I'd like that. Thank you.
As she continued walking home, Maya realized that she had somehow managed to build exactly the life she had dreamed of when she first decided to pursue social work. Meaningful work that made a tangible difference in people's lives, professional recognition that felt earned rather than given, and family relationships that were finally based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval.
But more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she had never fully understood before. That her sensitivity to others' needs, her emotional investment in causes she believed in, her willingness to take personal risks for community benefit, all the qualities her father had criticized as weaknesses, were actually the foundation of her professional strength. The girl who had been called worthless at dinner had become a woman whose worth was recognized not just by her supervisor and her community, but finally, most importantly, by herself. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Maya's new office as she reviewed the quarterly reports spread across her desk. The numbers told a story that still felt almost too good to be true. Program enrollment had increased by 68% since she had taken over as director. 3 additional community centers had adopted their intergenerational literacy model, and the teaching garden had not only become self-sustaining, but was now generating enough surplus produce to supply the local food bank. Maya's phone rang, displaying a number she recognized immediately. Riverside Community Center, this is Maya. Maya, it's Dr. Patricia Williams. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Dr. Williams. What can I do for you? Actually, I'm calling with an opportunity. The National Association of Community Development Organizations is hosting their annual conference in Chicago next month, and they're looking for someone to present on innovative models for intergenerational programming. Your name came up immediately when they contacted me for recommendations. Maya felt a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Speaking at a national conference would mean sharing their work with community leaders from across the country, potentially influencing policy and program development on a scale she had never imagined possible. I'd be honored, she said. What would they want me to focus on? Everything, Dr. Williams laughed. The literacy program, the community partnerships, the sustainability model, the family engagement strategies. Maya, what you've built here in 6 months is exactly the kind of innovation the field needs to see. You're not just running a program, you're demonstrating a completely different approach to community development. After she hung up, Maya sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what was happening. When she had stormed out of Romano's 6 months ago, she had been defending work that mattered to her personally. Now, that work was being recognized as a model for national replication. Her assistant knocked on her doorframe. Maya, your 9 o'clock is here. Maya looked up to see Linda standing in the doorway, wearing the professional clothes she had started buying when she enrolled in education courses at the community college. Her mother had not only become one of their most effective adult literacy coordinators, but had also begun working toward a teaching certificate that would allow her to formally join the staff. Ready for our monthly check-in? Linda asked, settling into the chair across from Maya's desk with a folder of program reports. This had become their routine, official monthly meetings to discuss the literacy program's progress, followed by lunch where they talked as mother and daughter about everything that was changing in their lives. Maya treasured these conversations, not just because they had given her a closer relationship with her mother, but because they had shown her what was possible when people were allowed to grow into their full potential. How are our retention rates looking? Maya asked, opening her own copy of the monthly reports. 92%, Linda said with obvious pride. And that's across all demographic groups. Maya, the peer mentorship component you added last month is working beautifully. When graduates stay involved as mentors, it creates this incredible sense of community ownership. Maya nodded, making notes in the margins of her report. What about the business partnerships? Any new developments there?
3 new companies signed up for our job placement program this week, Linda said, consulting her notes, and Henderson Manufacturing wants to discuss sponsoring an entire cohort of participants for their customer service training program. Maya felt a deep satisfaction as she listened to her mother's updates. Linda had discovered a talent for relationship building that complemented Maya's program development skills perfectly. Together, they had created something more comprehensive and effective than either could have managed alone. "There's something else," Linda said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Your father called me yesterday. He wanted to know if we thought you'd be interested in having lunch with him. Just the two of them. No family dinner pressure, no audience. He said he has some things he wants to discuss with you." Maya felt her chest tighten slightly with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any mention of her father. Their relationship had improved significantly over the past 6 months. He had stopped criticizing her career choices, had even attended the community center's annual fundraiser, and seemed genuinely impressed by what he saw. But they hadn't yet learned how to have comfortable one-on-one conversations. Did he say what he wanted to discuss? Linda hesitated, then smiled in a way that suggested she knew more than she was saying. He mentioned something about wanting their advice on a business decision he's considering. 2 years later, Maya stood at the podium of the Chicago Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 800 community development professionals from across North America. Her PowerPoint presentation was ready, her notes were organized, and her message was clear. Sustainable community change happened not through top-down programming, but through building systems that allowed communities to identify and address their own needs. When we started the Intergenerational Literacy Initiative, we thought we were simply addressing adult education needs in our neighborhood. What we discovered was that we were actually creating a model for community-driven development that has implications far beyond literacy. She clicked to her next slide, which showed a map dotted with pins representing the 43 communities that had now implemented some version of their program model. Each of these communities adapted our basic framework to address their specific needs and assets. In rural Montana, they focused on agricultural education and environmental sustainability. In urban Detroit, they emphasized job training and small business development. In suburban Phoenix, they created intergenerational language exchange programs for their multicultural population. Maya paused, scanning the audience and feeling a deep sense of connection to people who had dedicated their careers to community service. "The key insight," she continued, "is that sustainable programming requires 3 elements: genuine community ownership, intergenerational participation, and economic viability. When all 3 elements are present, programs don't just survive funding cuts or leadership changes. They actually grow stronger over time." During the question and answer session that followed, Maya found herself fielding inquiries about everything from grant writing strategies to staff development models to family engagement techniques. Each question reinforced her understanding that the work she had started in her neighborhood had touched on universal challenges faced by communities everywhere. "Dr. Chen," said a woman from Portland, using the title Maya had earned through her recently completed doctorate in community development, "your presentation suggests that community change and individual growth are interconnected."
Maya smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. That's an insightful question. I think authentic community development requires practitioners who are willing to grow alongside the communities they serve. We can't help others reach their potential if we're not continually working to reach our own. She paused, considering how much of her personal story to share with this professional audience. "I'll say this. 3 years ago, I was a program coordinator struggling to earn respect from my own family for the work I was passionate about. The process of learning to advocate for my community taught me how to advocate for myself. The skills I developed helping others navigate systems of power turned out to be the same skills I needed to advance in my own career. Community development and personal development aren't separate processes. They're aspects of the same fundamental work." After her presentation, Maya was approached by dozens of conference attendees wanting to continue the conversation. She exchanged contact information with educators from rural Alaska, urban planners from Toronto,
policy researchers from Mexico City, and nonprofit directors from small towns throughout the Midwest. Each conversation reinforced her understanding that the hunger for authentic community connection was universal, regardless of geographic or cultural context. As she walked back to her hotel that evening, Maya's phone buzzed with messages of congratulation from colleagues back home. Sarah, now the state director of community engagement, had sent a photo of the staff watching Maya's live-streamed presentation with the caption, "So proud of what you've built." Her mother had texted simply, "Watching my daughter change the world. Love you." But the message that surprised her most was from her father. "Maya, I watched your presentation online this afternoon. Your grandmother would be so proud. Could we have lunch when you get back? I have something I want to discuss with you." 5 years later, Maya's house, the small 2-bedroom bungalow she had purchased in the neighborhood where she worked, was filled with the laughter and conversation of what had become a monthly tradition, Sunday dinner for the extended community of people whose lives had intersected through the programs she had helped create. Mrs. Rodriguez was in the kitchen with Linda, teaching Maya's mother to make authentic tamales while they debated the merits of different approaches to teaching English pronunciation. Marcus Williams, now a junior at the State University studying education, was helping Maya's father set up chairs in the living room while they discussed the financial planning workshop Thomas had started offering to program participants. The transformation in her father had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past few years. His initial interest in offering financial literacy workshops had grown into a comprehensive volunteer commitment that included tax preparation services for low-income families, small business development consultation, and mentorship for adult learners who wanted to start their own enterprises. She had watched him discover the same satisfaction in direct service work that had always motivated her, and their relationship had evolved from tentative peace into genuine mutual respect. Maya called James Patterson, the former board treasurer who had become both a close friend and a romantic partner over the past 2 years. "Should I start the grill? People are getting hungry." Maya looked around her living room filled with people who represented every aspect of her life: family, colleagues, program participants, community partners, neighbors who had become friends. This was what success looked like to her. Not a corner office or an impressive salary, though she had both, but a life woven into community in ways that felt both purposeful and joyful. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Watching the news coverage of your UNESCO award nomination. Remember when you thought you weren't ambitious enough?" Maya smiled, thinking about the girl who had sat in Romano's restaurant 5 years ago, absorbing criticism that felt like absolute truth. That person's dreams had been so much smaller than what reality had actually offered. She had hoped for respect from her father, meaningful work that she was engaged in, and the ability to make a difference.
Work, financial stability. She had never imagined that her passion for community service would lead to national recognition, international speaking opportunities, a doctorate, a book deal, and most importantly, a sense of personal fulfillment that felt unshakable. "Maya," her father said, approaching with 2 glasses of the wine James had brought, "do you have a minute? I wanted to talk to you about something." They stepped out onto the back porch, where the community garden had expanded into a demonstration space that was now featured in urban planning textbooks as an example of successful neighborhood revitalization. The evening air was warm with the scent of tomatoes and herbs, and Maya could hear the distant sound of children playing in the park that had been built where an abandoned lot used to stand. "I've been thinking about what you said a few years ago," Thomas began, his voice carrying a humility that had taken Maya years to recognize as genuine rather than strategic. "About how individual impact matters as much as broader recognition. About how changing one life at a time adds up to changing the world." Maya waited, sensing that he was building towards something significant. "I wanted you to know that watching you build all this, not just the programs, but the community, the relationships, the way people trust you and come to you with their problems, it's taught me something about what success actually looks like." He paused, staring out at the garden where families from the neighborhood were still working even as the sun set. "Your grandmother was right. I was repeating my father's mistakes, measuring everything by the wrong standards." Maya felt a familiar tightness in her throat, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of peace she had never associated with conversations with her father. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. But you know what?
Watching you discover your own passion for community service, seeing how good you are at helping people understand their finances and plan for their futures, that's been one of the best parts of all this for me. You found a way to use your skills for something that really matters to you. Thomas smiled, and Maya realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face during a serious conversation. I have something to ask you. Your mother and I have been talking, and we want to establish a scholarship fund for adult learners who want to continue their education but can't afford the costs. We'd like to fund it through the business, make it an annual commitment. Would you help us set it up through the center? Maya felt tears start behind her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming recognition of how completely her family had transformed. Her father wasn't just acknowledging her work, he was asking to become part of it, to contribute his resources toward the goals she had always pursued. "Dad," she said softly, "I would be honored to help you set that up, and I think I know exactly the right person to help us design the program. Mom's been working on an adult education certificate, and she has ideas about support services that could make a huge difference." As they rejoined the dinner party, Maya caught James's eye across the room. He was deep in conversation with Marcus about engineering programs at the university, but he paused to smile at her with the expression of someone who understood that he was witnessing something important. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than dramatic gestures, and Maya treasured the way he supported her work without trying to become the center of it. "Maya," Mrs. Rodriguez called from the kitchen, "come settle an argument. Your mother thinks we should add more cumin to the tamales, but I say they're perfect as they are." Maya laughed, making her way toward the kitchen where the two women had become genuine friends despite the language barriers that had initially made communication challenging. This was what community looked like. Not perfect harmony, but ongoing negotiation, mutual support, and the kind of disagreements that came from people who cared enough about each other to express their honest opinions.
As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Maya found herself standing in her living room with Linda, helping to clean up while they talked about the week ahead. "Maya," her mother said, carefully wrapping leftover tamales, "do you ever think about having children? Not pressure," she added quickly, "just curiosity. You're so good with the kids in your programs, and watching you with Marcus and the other young people who come through here." Maya considered the question, which had been surfacing more frequently as she settled into a life that felt both full and stable. "I think about it," she said honestly. "James and I have talked about it. But you know what's interesting? I feel like I'm already raising kids in a way. All these young people who come through our programs, who need mentoring and support and someone who believes in them, they're part of my family too." Linda nodded with understanding. "That's exactly how I felt about the students in my literacy classes. There's something about watching someone discover their own capabilities that feels like watching a child grow up." But to answer your question directly, yes, I think James and I probably will have children, when we're ready, when we've figured out how to balance that with everything else we're building. As her mother gathered her things to leave, Maya realized that this was the first conversation they had ever had about her future that didn't center around her father's expectations or her own defensiveness. They were simply two women talking about life choices, hopes, and possibilities. 10 years later, Dr. Maya Chen Patterson stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York, addressing the Global Summit on Community Development. Her presentation was the culmination of a decade of work that had grown from a single community center in her neighborhood to an internationally recognized model for sustainable local development. "When we talk about addressing global challenges," she was saying to an audience that included representatives from 67 countries, "we often think in terms of top-down policy solutions or large-scale institutional interventions. But what we've learned over the past decade is that the most sustainable changes happen when communities are empowered to identify their own assets and address their own needs." She clicked to a slide showing a world map dotted with hundreds of pins, each representing a community that had adapted some version of the intergenerational programming model she had pioneered.
From urban neighborhoods in Sao Paulo to rural villages in Bangladesh, from small towns in Montana to indigenous communities in northern Canada, we've seen the same pattern emerge. When you combine literacy education with community partnership development, when you connect different generations and shared learning experiences, when you create economic sustainability through local ownership, you don't just solve immediate problems, you build communities' capacity to solve future problems they haven't even encountered yet. In the audience, Maya could see Sarah, who had become a close friend and professional collaborator over the years, taking notes for the policy brief they would publish together. Next to her sat Dr. Williams, now in her 70s, but still actively involved in educational advocacy work. And in the front row, Linda and Thomas. Her parents had become such committed advocates for community development that they had established a consulting firm specializing in helping small businesses develop community partnership programs. The key insight, Maya continued, is that social capital and human capital are interconnected. When you strengthen relationships within a community, you also strengthen individual capacity for growth and change. When you invest in individual learning and development, you also invest in the community's collective ability to address challenges. During the break between sessions, Maya was approached by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a development specialist from Mexico, who had been implementing modified versions of Maya's programs in rural communities throughout Latin America. Dr. Chen Patterson, she said, I wanted to thank you for the technical assistance your organization provided when we were getting started. But more than that, I wanted you to know
That your model has helped us understand something crucial about development work. That the communities we serve aren't problems to be solved, but partners to be supported. Maya felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that her work had contributed to a shift in perspective that went beyond any specific program or intervention. This was the kind of impact that mattered most to her, not just helping individual communities, but influencing how development professionals thought about their relationship to the communities they served. As she walked back to her hotel that evening, Maya's phone rang with a call from James. How did it go? He asked, and she could hear the sounds of children in the background, their 6-year-old daughter Emma and 4-year-old son David, who were spending the week with their father while Maya was traveling. It went well, Maya said, really well. The response was incredible, and I think we're going to see some significant policy changes come out of these discussions. Emma wants to know if you're going to be on TV again, James said, and she could hear her daughter's voice in the background asking if Mommy was famous. Maya laughed. Tell Emma that Mommy's work is important, but the most important thing about it is that it helps people. And tell her I'll be home tomorrow night with stories about all the amazing people I met. As she ended the call, Maya reflected on how completely her definition of success had evolved over the past decade. Yes, she had achieved professional recognition that exceeded anything she had dreamed of when she was starting out, but the real measure of her success wasn't the awards or the speaking invitations or the policy influence. It was the life she had built with people she loved, doing work that mattered in a community that had become an extended family. 15 years later, the auditorium at Riverside University was packed beyond capacity for what had been billed as Dr. Maya Chen Patterson's final keynote address before her transition from active practice to emeritus status. At 51, Maya had decided to step back from the intense travel and speaking schedule that had characterized the past decade of her career, choosing instead to focus on writing, mentoring, and spending time with her family. Emma, now 21 and a senior studying international development, sat in the front row next to her brother, David, who at 19 had surprised everyone by choosing to study engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure development. James was in the audience, along with what felt like half the city. Program participants from across the years, colleagues from dozens of organizations, city officials, and community leaders whose lives had intersected with Maya's work. 15 years ago, Maya began, I stood up in a restaurant and defended work that I loved, but that others thought was insignificant. I had no idea that moment would lead to everything that followed.
The programs we've built together, the communities we've supported, the policy changes we'd influenced, the relationships that have become the foundation of my life. She paused, scanning the audience and noting faces that represented every chapter of her professional journey. But if I've learned anything over these years, it's that sustainable change doesn't happen because of individual brilliance or heroic efforts. It happens because collective commitment to shared values. It happens because communities decide to invest in themselves and each other. It happens because ordinary people choose to use their skills and resources for purposes larger than their own immediate benefit. Maya clicked to her final slide, which showed a photograph taken just the week before. 4 generations of women working together in the teaching garden that had become a model for food security programming across the region. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 80s, but still actively mentoring new immigrant families. Linda, whose adult education certificate had led to a full-time teaching position and recognition as the state's Volunteer Educator of the Year. Emma, home from college and teaching nutrition classes to teenagers. And Maya herself, hands deep in soil, surrounded by the community that had shaped her as much as she had shaped it.
The question I'm asked most frequently, Maya continued, is what advice I would give to young people who want to make a difference in the world. And my answer is always the same. Start where you are, with what you have, serving the people who are already around you. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Don't wait for someone else to validate your vision. Start building the world you want to live in, one relationship at a time. As the applause subsided, Maya felt a deep sense of completion. Not ending, but completion. The satisfaction of having lived fully into her purpose, of having used her gifts in service of something larger than herself, of having created work that would continue long after she was no longer actively leading it. During the reception that followed, Maya was approached by countless people wanting to share how her work had influenced their own paths. Marcus Williams, now Dr. Marcus Williams, and the Director of Educational Equity Programs for the state, brought his teenage daughter to meet Dr. Maya, the woman whose programs had changed the trajectory of his life. Sarah, now retired but still actively consulting on community development projects, presented Maya with a leather-bound book containing letters from communities around the world that had implemented versions of her programming model. But the moment that moved Maya most deeply came when Thomas, now 81 and still volunteering with their financial literacy programs, approached with tears in his eyes. "Maya," he said, his voice shaky with emotion, "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. That night at Romano's, when I called you worthless, that was the biggest mistake I ever made as a father. Not because of what you've accomplished since then, but because you are never worthless. You were always exactly who you needed to be." Maya hugged her father, feeling the weight of decades of complicated history finally resolving into something that felt like peace. "Dad," she said softly, "that night was actually a gift. It forced me to stop seeking approval from people who didn't understand my work and start building relationships with people who shared my values. It taught me that my worth doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition of it." As the evening wound down, Maya found herself standing outside the university building with James and their children, looking up at stars that were barely visible through the city's light pollution. "What's next, Mom?" Emma asked. "After you finish the book, after you're done with the consulting projects?" Maya smiled, thinking about the question that had been occupying her thoughts more frequently as she prepared for this transition. "I want to learn something new. Maybe pottery, maybe gardening techniques I haven't tried yet, maybe how to be a grandmother someday if you and David ever decide to have children. The point is, I want to keep growing, keep discovering new ways to contribute."
David laughed. Mom, you're going to be the kind of grandmother who teaches her grandkids how to write grant proposals. Maybe, Maya said, laughing with him. Or maybe I'll teach them how to grow tomatoes and read to elderly people and stand up for what they believe in, even when it's scary. As they walked home through the neighborhood that had become the center of Maya's life's work, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been called worthless at dinner had become a woman whose worth was measured not in approval from others, but in relationships built, community strengthened, and lives changed through the simple but revolutionary act of treating every person as inherently valuable. The teaching garden they passed was quiet now, but Maya could imagine tomorrow's activities. Children learning about plant biology, adults practicing English while they harvested vegetables, teenagers earning community service credits while they taught gardening techniques to seniors. The work would continue without her daily involvement, carried forward by people who had discovered their own capacity for leadership through the programs she had helped create. This was legacy. Not individual achievement, but collective transformation. Not being indispensable, but creating systems that made everyone more capable. Not being remembered for what she had accomplished alone, but for what they had all accomplished together.
Maya looked up at the stars one more time, thinking about her grandmother's stories of building something from nothing, of using education and determination to create opportunities that hadn't existed before. Nai would be proud, Maya thought, not just of the external recognition or professional success, but of the life Maya had built around service, community, and the radical belief that everyone, absolutely everyone, had something valuable to contribute. As they reached their front door, Maya's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Dr. Chen Patterson, my name is Sophia. I'm starting a community development program in my neighborhood, and I've been studying your work. I have a question. How do you find the courage to keep going when people tell you your dreams are too small or too big or just impossible? I could really use some guidance. Maya smiled, already composing her response in her mind. This was how change really happened. One person reaching out to another, one question leading to one conversation, one community inspiring another community to believe in their own potential. She typed back, Sophia, the courage comes from community. Find people who share your values. Start with small actions that matter to the people around you, and remember that the world is changed by ordinary people who refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they are. Would you like to schedule a call? I'd love to hear about your vision. The work would continue, in new forms, with new leaders, addressing new challenges, but grounded in the same fundamental truth Maya had discovered that night in Romano's restaurant 15 years ago, that every person has inherent worth, that communities have the capacity to solve their own problems when given appropriate support, and that the most powerful form of activism is simply treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve. Maya stepped inside her house, surrounded by family, rooted in community, confident that the seeds she had planted would continue growing long after she was gone. The silence had never been forgotten. The voices had never been stronger.